So not to be left out of the release game, AMD dropped the RX 7600 today, their new $270 contender. Yep, they dropped the price $30 since the announcement. So let's find out how this stacks up against the outgoing 6600 XT right there and NVIDIA's offerings in the same price point.
The Montech Titan Gold ATX 3.0 power supplies feature a Gen 5 PCIe power connector for adapter-free 40 series GPU installation and is available in 750, 850, 1000, and 1200 watt versions, giving you the power needed to power today's demanding PC components. 100% Japanese 105C capacitors provide improved performance, while the 135mm fluid dynamic bearing fan with 0 RPM mode keep all components cool even during the most demanding workloads, all while the 80+ gold rating and 10-year warranty provide end-user peace of mind. Check out the Titan Gold lineup of Montech power supplies by clicking on the sponsored link in the description below.
All right, so let's talk about the cards that we chose for today's benchmarks and where the 7600 fits into the current landscape of pricing. We went ahead and tested it against the RX 6600 XT right there, which is its outgoing older sibling. However, the 6650 XT is the current offering right now. We didn't have one on hand, but the pricing for the 6650 XT right now is right at $270, which is exactly where the 7600 is. So that's gonna be an interesting comparison. We went ahead and threw in the 6750 XT as well, just to see what a higher end offering for the next performance tier up from AMD would look like. We threw in the Intel Arc A750 Limited as well, which is an 8GB card. Intel's been improving the driver pretty significantly recently, so we went ahead and retested the A750 Limited to throw in those numbers and see where it compares right now. Now the A750 is interesting because you can pick it up for $250, all the way up to about $290 for a slightly overclocked custom card. As far as the NVIDIA side of the comparison, we went ahead and used the RTX 3060 TUF by Asus, and the RTX 3050 as well. 3060 TUF is gonna be interesting to take a look at because the cheapest 3060 I could find on Amazon today was $315, and that TUF, that specific TUF model, is $380. The TUF does have a VRAM advantage over the 7600 because it has 12 gigs of VRAM versus the 7600's 8, as well as a 192-bit bus versus the 7600's 128-bit bus. However, as you're gonna see in these slides, doesn't really matter that much for NVIDIA. So without spoiling anything else, let's just jump right in on the numbers. First off is TimeSpy Extreme. 7600 did a great showing here, handily beating the 6600 XT Merc, and the NVIDIA cards are just left in the dust down below. The A750, I think, really likes the 3D Mark TimeSpy engine for some reason. It is scoring really high, and even higher now with the new driver, and the 6750 XT rounding up the top. The other synthetic test that we run is 3D Mark Port Royal, just to test how ray tracing performs. Again, we see the 7600 solidly beating the 6600 XT. No surprise there, it's the outgoing card. The 3060 TUF puts up a good fight against the 7600 in this test, however, it still comes up short. 3050 is just, it's just not anything to write home about here. A750 again with its newer RT cores, which I gotta give it to Intel. For their first generation of ray tracing stuff, the Arc series is punching way above its weight. Moving on to real world testing, we're gonna start with Borderlands 3. Again, no surprise, the RX 6750 XT is taking the top spot in this test. That being said, Borderlands is, again, a very AMD favoring title, and so it's no surprise to see the 3060 and the 3050 down at the bottom. But the A750 is still doing a decent showing here. In 1440p, it's right behind the 6600 XT. It loses over 10 frames in 1080p. But hey, the A750 is not doing that bad. Moving on to Cyberpunk No Ray Tracing, the 7600 scored a good 10 FPS gain in 1080p over the 6600 XT Merc. About the same FPS in 1440 as well. The A750 climbs ahead of the 6600 XT in Cyberpunk non-ray tracing, which is pretty interesting again. Like I've said before, Intel's driver team is making huge strides in improving their performance, and it's been really interesting to see the difference in these scores. And no surprise, as usual, the RTX 3060 and the 3050 rounding up the bottom of the chart. Next up is Forza Horizon 5, which is another slightly AMD favoring title. The 7600 pulls 92 FPS in 1080p, just 1 FPS above the 6600 XT. So we didn't really see that much of a generational improvement in this title. 2 more FPS in 1440p. Again, the 3060 TUF is well below the 7600, about 20 FPS below in Forza Horizon 5 at 1080p. It's not looking good for the NVIDIA cards in this comparison. In Gears of War 5, we finally saw the 3060 Tough take technically a victory in 1440p. It got 4 more FPS than the 7600. However, it tied at 1080p at 108 FPS exactly. The 6600 XT is a little bit behind the 7600 as well, and A750 down at the bottom. Gears of War really likes the 3060. It might have to do with the extra VRAM that the 3060 has. The 7600 unfortunately takes another loss in Guardians of the Galaxy non-ray tracing to the 3060 Tough. However, again, the 3060 at the cheapest is $315, which makes it $45 more than the 7600. The 6600 XT is right behind the 7600 as usual, only a few frames below. And the last traditional rasterization test that we did, which is Shadow of the Tomb Raider non-ray traced, again, pretty much the same order. 7600 at 141 FPS, 6600 below that by a decent amount actually, 10 FPS or 9 FPS less. Below the 6600 again is the 3060 and the A750 and then the 3050 of course, rounding up the bottom of the chart. So it's interesting that the 3060 seems to trade blows with the A750 more so than competing with the 7600. In almost all the cases, the 7600 is significantly above the 3060 Tough. And that's the Tough with the 12 gigs instead of the 8 gig which it launched with, etc., etc. Again, that Tough that is in this chart is almost, actually it's more than $100 more than the 7600. So this is looking better and better with each chart. Okay, so now we're gonna move on to ray tracing tests. Now AMD has traditionally been lagging behind in its ray tracing technology, so it's gonna be interesting to see what the 7600 does. However, all of these cards are low-end cards, and so ray tracing is almost like oh cool, it can do it, versus something that you're probably going to want to be playing with enabled the whole time. That being said, let's go ahead and just start with Shadow of the Tomb Raider with ray tracing shadows enabled. Now here you see NVIDIA's 2nd gen RT cores with the 3060 Tough putting up a much better fight against the 7600. Ties it in 1080, it actually essentially ties it in both 1080 and 1440. There's 1 FPS less for the 7600 to 1440p, which is within margin of error. The 6600 has a decent gap below that, owing to its slower RT cores as well. And A750, as much as it tried, it could only muster up about 76 FPS. Moving on to Metro Exodus's ray trace mode. Metro Exodus is an interesting engine. I think it very much prefers the Intel Arc card, as the A750 is smack dab on top of this chart, even beating out the RX 6750 XT from AMD, which was surprising and the only title that it did this on. 7600 has a decent lead over the 3060 in Metro Exodus as well at 1080p. As far as Guardians of the Galaxy with ray tracing enabled, seems to favor the NVIDIA cards, of course. The RTX 3060 Tough is the one that's on top of this chart, with the 6750 not that far behind and tying it in 1440p. The A750 then follows, which is interesting. It's actually beating the 7600 by a significant amount, especially in 1440p. The 7600 and the 6600 are pretty much right behind each other, and the 3050 rounding up the bottom of the chart. And last but not least, the good old Cyberpunk 2077 Ray Tracing Ultra preset. 3060 Tough taking the top score in this one with 29 FPS at 1080p. Again, as usual, these numbers are with no scalar tech enabled, so no XeSS, no DLSS, no FSR for all of these cards. Just raw, render me all the pixels, and then we'll worry about the performance later on. A thing to note with our benchmarks is we always test the hardest case, like the worst case scenario for each card. So that way you know that if these numbers aren't up to what you want out of the card, you can always lower your graphics settings in the game to get more performance out of it. The A750 surprised us by only being 1 FPS below the 3060 Tough in ray tracing Cyberpunk, which is obviously a very heavy test to run as far as RT goes. Again, Intel's RT cores, even though they're 1st generation, pretty much came out of the gate swinging, and it shows here. The 7600 is actually below the 3050 in this ray tracing test with 16 FPS. It didn't do that much better than the 6600 as well. That's an interesting story as far as really heavy ray tracing with the 7600. So basically, don't do it. Don't run some super crazy RT on this card unless you're expecting to have to be using FSR at probably balanced or performance or even ultra performance, depending on the game. You're gonna need to use FSR for appreciable frame rates if you're gonna be hitting this tiny little thing with a crap ton of rays for it to trace. All right, so let's wrap things up with the RX 7600 from AMD. Jay and I went over the charts, and this thing has a lot going for it. All right, so let's start with the good. It's outperforming the 6600 XT at roughly the same price. So that's awesome because you don't have to pay more money for more performance. You're paying the same money. It's solidly beating the 3060 and the 3050. The 3060 being significantly more expensive and having more VRAM, which is really impressive for this little guy. Again, the 3060 was only really dominating in a few tests. In the vast majority of the regular tests, not including ray tracing, the 7600 was the card to beat. Now we had an interesting showing from the Intel Arc A750 with whatever the latest driver is as far as May 2023 is concerned. However, it's still kind of too inconsistent for me to recommend the A750, especially because the A750 is only coming out on top of the 7600 in ray tracing tests. It almost seems like the only time the other cards can really get on top of the 7600 is when you throw something that the 7600 is not very good at, which is very heavy ray tracing. As far as just rasterization performance, you guys saw the charts. The 7600 is holding its own for sure. The only cons that I could really think of, though, is the fact that it was losing out in ray tracing performance to the 3060. However, the 3060 being $315 at its cheapest that I could find today, again, May 2023, it's tough to recommend the 3060 over the 7600 when it's only beating the 7600 in, again, just like the A750, specific cases, and it's more pricey at the least. If not, you're probably gonna be paying at least $350 to $380 for a 3060. That 315 one's probably gonna be gone soon. So yeah, the RX 7600 is a solid contender for 1080p gaming. It's cheaper than $300, 270 again, after they lowered the price. And it's beating the NVIDIA cards that are significantly more expensive and also have 4 more gigabytes of VRAM and a larger bus. This thing has 8 gigabytes of GDDR6 with a 128-bit bus, whereas the 3060 TUF has 12 gigabytes with a 192-bit bus. So for the 3060 to still be losing to the RX 7600, even though this thing only has 8 gigs of VRAM, it's pretty impressive for this thing. It's not really that good at ray tracing performance, but I mean, no surprise there. Pretty much all these cards in this price point are in a bracket where I would consider RT as a novelty as opposed to something that you would probably be gaming on enabled 24/7 with your normal single player titles and that sort of stuff. Again, it's gonna be a great option for 1080p at max settings. And like I said earlier, our benchmarks are always at the highest presets. So you can get more FPS if you lower your settings a little bit. Jay thinks that it's gonna be a decent card at 1440p as well. However, you're probably going to have to drop some settings and you might be running into a little bit of VRAM constraints with that 8 gigabytes, but 1440p is not that much harder to run. So yeah, that's the AMD RX 7600. Punching above its weight for $270, especially when it comes to competing against NVIDIA. The 3060, even if you lower the price to match the 7600, it still doesn't win in enough charts. In fact, it loses pretty significantly in most charts and only takes wins in RT. And so it's very difficult to recommend the 3060 in comparison to this card. The 7600, again, I keep saying $270 because that's just blowing my mind that, you know, finally we're getting dope performance in this price bracket. So yeah, it's interesting to see how AMD's filling out this RDNA3 product stack. It was interesting to drop the super high-end cards and then go all the way down to a 600 tier without an XT for this card. But looking around at its competitors in the same price bracket, it's hard to not recommend anything but the 7600. So what do you guys think of these new cards coming out recently? Are they finally starting to get into your price range, or are you still waiting to see what the future of competition shapes up to be? Sound off in the comments below, and as always, we'll see you guys in the next one.